Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was during one of those fog-choked London mornings in early March, when the city wakes reluctantly, and every street lamp glows with a faint, ghostly halo, that I was roused from sleep by an urgent knocking upon the door of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, already at his breakfast with the remains of a Turkish cigarette curling smoke into the air, barely glanced up. "That," he murmured, "is the tread of someone unaccustomed to stairs, but forced to climb them in haste. Elderly, possibly in distress." I had scarcely time to throw on a dressing gown when Mrs. Hudson opened the door to admit a gentleman whose appearance, though proper and dignified, betrayed a deep agitation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, removing his gloves with shaking fingers, "I beg your pardon for this intrusion at such an early hour. I am Sir Reginald Thorncroft of Holmbury Park." At the mention of the name, I noted Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly. He gestured toward the armchair before the fireplace. "Pray sit, Sir Reginald. A man of your influence does not call upon a consulting detective before breakfast without grave reason." The gentleman seated himself, but it was several moments before he could collect his breath sufficiently to speak. I, meanwhile, studied him carefully. His hair was iron gray, brushed meticulously backward, his cheeks pale and his eyes unusually bloodshot for the hour. He bore the expression of a man who had witnessed something both impossible and horrific. "It is my niece, Miss Eleanor Thorncroft," he said at last. "She was found this morning. Murdered." There was a silence in the room, broken only by the faint clinking of Holmes stirring his tea. "I'm sorry," Holmes said at length. "Please go on." "She was discovered in her bedroom at precisely dawn, the door locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no open windows. And yet—" he swallowed heavily, "and yet someone, or something, had murdered her. What's more, my housekeeper and valet both swear to have heard a scream just before 6, a scream unlike anything human, high-pitched, metallic, inhuman, they said." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "She was quite alone?" Holmes asked. "Alone and quite safe, or so we believed. My niece, you see, had recently returned from 3 years abroad. India, to be precise. She was a strong-willed young woman, fond of unusual trinkets and inclined toward what I can only call occult interests." Holmes's eyes lit with that particular glimmer I had come to recognize, the glimmer of intellectual hunger. "She kept with her a curious object," Sir Reginald continued, "a silver locket in the shape of a weeping angel. Claimed to have acquired it in Madurai through dubious means. She never took it off, not even at night. Said it spoke to her in dreams." He gave a nervous laugh, which did not match the pallor of his skin. "And now, this morning, the locket was found open on the floor beside her, screaming, still screaming." I confess I jolted at that. "You heard it yourself?" Holmes asked calmly. "I did. Though by the time I reached the room, the sound had ceased. The police do not believe me, of course. They've already dismissed the matter as some form of madness or hysteria. But I know what I heard." Holmes stood and walked to the window. The fog outside was thick enough to blur the gas lights. "And the room?" he asked. "Describe it." "Ordinary in every respect. Window bolted, door locked from within. No sign of struggle, no sign of anyone leaving. And yet my niece lay in the center of the floor as if she had collapsed from fright. Her eyes wide open, her mouth contorted. But there was no blood, no mark, nothing. The coroner cannot even confirm the cause of death." "Death from terror?" I asked. "That is the current speculation. But what kind of terror kills a healthy young woman in a locked room?" Holmes turned, his gaze sharpening. "That, Sir Reginald, is precisely the question we must answer. And where is this screaming locket now?" "In my pocket," the man said hesitantly, "though I dare not wear it." The inspector insisted I remove it from the scene for examination, but he scoffed at the notion that it ever emitted sound. "I assure you, it did scream, Mr. Holmes. a piercing sound that made the hairs on my neck stand. Holmes extended his hand. "May I?" Sir Reginald produced a handkerchief-wrapped bundle from his coat and unwrapped it gingerly to reveal the object in question. It was beautiful in a grim, antique way. The locket was no larger than a crown coin, its silver face tarnished with age. The figure etched upon it, an angel, no, a woman, was bent over as though weeping, her wings folded like jagged blades. Holmes did not touch it immediately, but examined it from several angles. "There is a groove here," he murmured, "where it once hung from a chain. The catch is worn, but recently oiled. Note the hinge, Watson. Finely made." He sniffed it delicately. "Indian sandalwood and something else. Camphor, perhaps. No obvious mechanism for sound. But then again—" He paused, tapping the locket gently with a fingernail. A faint chime echoed from within, like a glass bell being struck underwater. "Curious," he said. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, has your household experienced any peculiar incidents recently? Sounds, movements, changes in temperature?" "Yes," the man said immediately. "Lights extinguished on their own, footsteps in the halls when none were present. One maid swore she saw a woman in white walking the gardens at night. I dismissed most of it, until now." Holmes looked at me, then back to our client. "Watson, pack your bag. We depart for Holmbury Park within the hour." Sir Reginald exhaled, visibly relieved. "I warn you," he said, rising. "The inspector, Lestrade, I believe, has made up his mind. He believes Eleanor suffered a seizure brought on by stress, but I know my niece. She was no fragile creature, and no seizure leaves behind a screaming locket." Holmes smiled faintly. "I rather think, Sir Reginald, that this will prove to be one of the more instructive cases of our career." He turned to me, already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson. A woman has died without a wound, in a locked room, with a locket that sings in the voice of death. If Scotland Yard finds this simple, then I am most curious to learn what they call difficult." And with that, the game was afoot. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Fog. The train to Holmbury Park was a slow one, winding its way through the damp English countryside like a silver serpent, trailing ribbons of steam. Outside our compartment, fields glistened with dew and the hedgerows were choked with mist. The air, though clean compared to London's soot-laced fog, carried a weight of melancholy that matched our client's grim tale. Holmes sat opposite me, long legs crossed, eyes closed in contemplation. The peculiar locket lay upon the fold-out table between us, still wrapped in the silk handkerchief as if it were a venomous thing. He had not spoken a word since we left Baker Street, save for a brief request for silence. For my part, I watched him in the manner of a man studying a painting he cannot yet interpret. There was something in his posture, not quite tension, but a coiled anticipation, as if some invisible thread had been plucked within his mind and was still reverberating. Finally, as the whistle of the engine shrieked into a bend, Holmes opened one eye. "You are bursting with questions, Watson. Do relieve yourself before you explode." I smiled. "Very well, though I suspect you have already drawn your conclusions while I am still lost at the starting gate." "Not conclusions," Holmes murmured. "Only directions." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a small magnifying lens, examining the corner of the locket through the handkerchief. I asked myself not how the locket screamed, but why. That is the more productive path. "You believe Sir Reginald was telling the truth?" I asked. Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. I believe he heard something. Whether it was the locket or his conscience is yet to be seen. "You suspect him?" "Suspect?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, I suspect everyone, including you." I gave a mock huff of indignation. "But seriously," I continued, leaning forward, "what do you make of the locked room? No sign of entry or exit, and the poor girl lying there, no wounds, no cause of death. It sounds like a ghost story. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the glass of the compartment window. There are only 3 possibilities in a locked room mystery, Watson. 1, the room was never truly locked. 2, the method of entry and exit is concealed. Or 3. He paused, and I found myself leaning forward again, only to see him close his eyes once more. Or 3, the crime was never committed at all in the way it appeared. I sat back, chewing on that. Holmbury Station was little more than a platform flanked by dense woods, the morning sun now struggling to pierce through the fog. A black carriage waited by the road, bearing the crest of the Thorncroft estate. The driver, a silent, gaunt man in livery, tipped his hat as we approached. The ride from the station to Holmbury Park took us through narrow lanes lined with skeletal trees. The countryside here had an old, forgotten look, as though it had slipped through the cracks of modernity and was content to remain in some mist-draped pocket of the past. When the manor finally came into view, I understood at once the nature of the place. Holmbury Park was vast, brooding, and of that peculiar Gothic persuasion which turns windows into watchful eyes and chimneys into sentinels. Vines clung to the stone like ancient scars, and a cold wind stirred the curtains in the upper floor as though the house itself were drawing breath. Sir Reginald met us at the door, still in his morning coat, his face drawn with fatigue. "Inspector Lestrade has arrived," he said at once, leading us into the drawing-room. He was less than pleased when I informed him I had summoned you. Holmes made a soft sound between a cough and a laugh. "Our dear friend Lestrade rarely is. Nevertheless, we must be allies in this unpleasant business." The drawing-room was vast, with heavy tapestries, a cracked marble hearth, and furniture that looked as if it had never been moved in 100 years. On the mantel sat a small portrait. Miss Eleanor Thorncroft, I presumed. A beautiful woman in her early 20s with a commanding presence even in stillness. Her eyes, wide, dark and intelligent, seemed to follow one across the room. "She had no enemies, to my knowledge," Sir Reginald said, noting our gaze. "And yet, there was something different about her since returning from India. Distant, distracted." Holmes nodded. "You mentioned her interest in the occult?" Sir Reginald looked uncomfortable. "Yes, she was curious, not obsessed. Books on mysticism, charms from bazaars. Nothing harmful, but she spoke often of fate, of things one couldn't escape." "Did she speak of fear?" Holmes asked. Sir Reginald hesitated. "Not openly, but I believe she was afraid of something. She kept her bedroom door locked at all times, even during the day. Insisted that the locket remain on her person, said it protected her from the silence." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. The silence? Before Sir Reginald could respond, a sharp voice rang from the hallway. "Holmes, I rather thought you'd show up. But I didn't think Sir Reginald would stoop to backdoor consultants so quickly." Lestrade entered, in his usual state of polite irritation. A wiry man with a thin mustache and sharper tongue, he gave us a curt nod. "Inspector," Holmes greeted him warmly. "Always a pleasure. May I see the scene?" Lestrade gave a theatrical sigh. "It's been cleaned, per regulations. Body removed, photographs taken. Nothing strange to find except a faint scorch mark on the rug and a locket nobody seems to understand. But if you want to go look at the bedroom, be my guest." He waved a hand toward the stairs. "I would like that very much," Holmes said, already moving. I followed, exchanging a glance with Sir Reginald, who looked as though the weight of a century had settled on his shoulders. The bedroom was on the eastern wing, tall windows, thick curtains, a 4-poster bed draped in dark velvet. A strange chill lingered in the air, though no window was open. Holmes stood silently in the doorway for a moment, then entered. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "No sign of forced entry. Bolt intact. No scuff on the sill. And yet—" He knelt beside the rug. A faint black circle, barely noticeable, stained the floorboards. "A mark," I said. "Yes, and a rather curious one, as though something had burned but left no ash. Look here, on the windowsill." He pointed to a delicate trail of silver dust, barely perceptible in the light. "Gunpowder?" I asked. "Unlikely. Too fine. Possibly crushed metal, or ash from incense." He stood again, walked to the fireplace, and stared up the flue. Then he turned to me with a smile that suggested the hunt had truly begun. "Watson, I believe our ghost has left a footprint." Chapter 3. A scene of deception. Though I had stood beside Sherlock Holmes at dozens of crime scenes, from back-alley murders to opium den strangulations, there was something deeply unsettling about the atmosphere within Miss Eleanor Thorncroft's bedroom. It wasn't merely the silence, though that in itself was strange. It was the absence of any apparent violence. No broken glass, no struggle, no blood. And yet a woman had died here. Holmes moved through the room like a shadow, hands behind his back, eyes flickering over every surface. The morning sun filtered through the velvet curtains in slanted beams, casting a reddish hue upon the polished wood and floral wallpaper. Dust motes swam in the air, made visible by the light, and for a moment I felt as if we were standing inside a memory. He paused at the vanity. "Curious," he murmured. "What is?" "There are 2 brushes here, one for the hair, one for the skin, but both are clean, too clean. No stray strands, no oils. Either Miss Thorncroft was in the habit of polishing her grooming tools obsessively, or someone cleaned them after her death." I bent closer. Indeed, both brushes looked recently washed, their bristles unnaturally white. Holmes moved on to the bedside table. A small lamp, a carafe of water, and a thin volume, the Bhagavad Gita, bound in soft maroon leather. He flipped through its pages, then held it to his nose. "Incense," he said. "Strong, jasmine and myrrh. Do you smell it, Watson?" I nodded. "Yes, but faint. It's as though someone tried to cover another scent." "Precisely." He moved toward the fireplace, where the faint scorch mark still darkened the rug. "You see this mark?" he asked. "Yes, as though something burned here. But look closer." I knelt beside him. The mark was circular, perhaps 8 inches in diameter, with no discernible pattern, but around its edge, almost invisible unless caught in the right light, was a trail of tiny crystalline fragments. "Salt?" I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Not quite. These are fragments of crushed quartz, possibly from a crystal charm or pendant. The kind sold at bazaars and mystical shops to ward off spirits. A ritual of some kind may have taken place here." My stomach turned slightly. "You think she was trying to protect herself?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned his attention to the large armoire in the corner. The doors creaked as he opened it. Inside were a dozen garments, elegant, Eastern-inspired dresses in silks and linens. A strong scent of camphor and something more bitter clung to them. He reached into the back of the wardrobe and withdrew a small tin container, almost invisible against the dark wood. It was sealed with wax. "Watson," he said, handing it to me. "Would you kindly open this?" With some effort, I broke the wax and pried off the lid. Inside was a grey powder, coarse and fibrous. "Herbs?" I asked. "Likely," Holmes replied. "Possibly aconite or belladonna, or a mixture used in ritual fumigations. Miss Thorncroft appears to have brought more than souvenirs from India." He turned as a knock came at the door. It was Lestrade, peering in with a raised brow. "Finished poking about in the curtains, Holmes?" "Nearly," Holmes replied pleasantly. "Well, when you're done with your ghost hunt, I've got something more solid downstairs. The gardener's come forward. Said he saw someone lurking near the east garden wall around the time of the scream. Tall man, heavy coat, not from the household." Did he get a look at the face? Too dark, he says, but he's certain it wasn't one of the staff. Holmes turned toward the window which overlooked the eastern gardens. He opened it and leaned out briefly, surveying the grounds. This wall here, is it high? Chest height, Lestrade replied. Could be climbed easily, though there's a hedge just behind it. Thorny as the devil. Holmes nodded. Then the intruder either left a trail or very painful scratches. He turned to me. Watson, bring your walking stick. Lestrade looked incredulous. You think someone climbed into a locked room? No, Holmes said, but I believe someone wanted us to think they did. We descended the stairs again, this time heading out the rear entrance and into the garden. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing the wide, frost-kissed lawn and the eastern wall, low, crumbling in places, and indeed lined with dense hedgerows. Holmes approached the spot indicated by Lestrade's man. I could see faint impressions in the wet soil, boot prints pointing toward the wall, but they were oddly spaced, too deliberate. Someone has been here, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, but the marks are too perfect. Do you see? A heavy heel, no toe drag, no variation in pressure. These are placed, not natural. Planted? Holmes nodded. Our man, if he exists, didn't jump this wall. He wanted someone to think he had, and whoever did this knows how to simulate footprints. I'd wager they used a weighted boot on a stick or rod. The spacing is too wide for a natural gait. Lestrade grunted. You think it's a distraction? I think it's a deception. We walked along the wall. Holmes paused suddenly and knelt again. Buried beneath a leafless fern was a strip of torn cloth. Dark wool, coarse in texture, with a smudge of what looked like ash. A fragment, Holmes said, rising. But not from a man's coat. This is from a servant's uniform, possibly torn during the night. Could be the gardener himself, Lestrade muttered. Possibly. But then we must ask why he came forward after the discovery, not before, and why this cloth was left where no gardener should be. As we re-entered the house, Holmes paused by the doorway and turned back to Lestrade. I shall want to interview the staff. Lestrade sighed. Be my guest. But I still say this looks like some sort of mental breakdown. No injuries, no poison. A woman alone in her room, dead from fright and wearing a cursed necklace. Sounds like superstition to me. Holmes gave a soft, unreadable chuckle. Sometimes, Lestrade, superstition is merely logic that hasn't yet found its footing. Back in the drawing room, Sir Reginald was waiting. Holmes approached him calmly. Sir Reginald, you mentioned that your niece had returned from India recently. Did she bring with her any close companions? Friends? Letters? Only her personal belongings, Sir Reginald replied, though she did receive one visitor, a man named Sebastian Locke, an archaeologist, I believe. Came once, tall, stern man. They spoke privately. I didn't inquire further. Do you know where we might find this Mr. Locke? He resides in Whitechapel, I believe. Something of a recluse. Holmes's eyes lit faintly. I shall be very interested to make his acquaintance. As the clock on the mantel struck noon, I could feel the shape of the mystery growing, like a fog-wrapped statue gradually coming into view. And though no blood had been spilled and no weapon found, I could not shake the feeling that we had just walked through a scene of carefully constructed illusion, designed, above all else, to confuse. But if it was a deception, I knew only one man who could see through it. Holmes, standing now with arms folded beneath the portrait of Eleanor, was smiling, not with satisfaction, with anticipation. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. By the time the long shadows of the afternoon began to creep across the grounds of Holmbury Park, Holmes had already dispatched Lestrade to summon the members of the household for questioning. Though the inspector grumbled about it being a waste of time, he complied, perhaps out of deference, or perhaps from a quiet curiosity he would never admit aloud. We returned to the drawing room. A low fire had been lit, though it did little to warm the cold stone of the manor. Holmes, always energized by the scent of a puzzle, stood at the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, waiting like a conductor before a symphony. Sir Reginald remained seated by the hearth, his brow furrowed. I could see he had aged 10 years in a single morning. "There are 6 household staff who might offer something useful," he said, "and one guest, Miss Isabella Hartwright. She arrived yesterday afternoon. Eleanor's childhood companion." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you will observe their expressions. Take note not only of what they say, but what they avoid." The first to enter was Mrs. Dunhill, the housekeeper, a stout, severe woman with a voice like rustling parchment. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from tears or age I could not tell. Miss Eleanor was a peculiar young lady, she began, clutching a small handkerchief in her calloused hands. But kind, never harsh, always polite. "You saw her last when?" Holmes asked. "Last night. I brought her tea at 8:30. She was in her sitting gown, reading at the window. She thanked me and said she would lock her door as usual." "Did you hear anything unusual in the night?" "Only the scream, sir. God save me, it chilled my bones. It wasn't like a person. It sounded metallic, like something scraping a violin string the wrong way. I've never heard anything like it." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "You have served this household for how long?" 21 years. "Then you would know Miss Eleanor's habits well." "Yes, sir." "Was she frightened of anyone here?" Mrs. Dunhill hesitated. Her lips moved without sound. I think she was wary of Mr. Lockwood, the manservant. Quiet sort. Too quiet. And always watching her." Holmes made a soft hum. "Thank you, Mrs. Dunhill." She curtsied and left. Next came Mr. Alton Lockwood, the aforementioned manservant. He was thin and pale, with a slightly stooped posture and the piercing eyes of a hawk. He seemed younger than I expected, no more than 30, though something in his demeanor gave the impression of one worn by secrets. "I have served the Thorncrofts for 3 years, he said in a soft voice, almost inaudible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "You attended Miss Eleanor regularly?" Holmes asked. "Only in errands. I delivered correspondence, arranged carriages, lit fires. She rarely spoke to me directly. Preferred privacy." "Did you see her last night?" "Yes, around 7. She asked me to burn a letter. I did so in the drawing-room hearth." "A letter?" Holmes straightened slightly. "From whom?" "I do not know. The envelope was foreign, I believe Indian script. She did not want it read." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "Did she often destroy letters?" "Never before, to my knowledge." Holmes leaned forward. "And what did she say to you when she handed it over?" Lockwood's lips tightened. "Only, this must not follow me." That phrase, so peculiar, so haunting, seemed to linger in the room after he left. Next came Miss Isabella Hartwright, and it was here, I believe, that the air changed entirely. She was a young woman of perhaps 26, dressed in mourning grey, with raven-black hair pinned neatly and eyes the colour of frost. Her bearing was proud, but grief clung to her like a veil. She sat without invitation and met Holmes' gaze squarely. "Miss Hartwright," Holmes said with careful courtesy, "you were Eleanor's closest companion." "Since childhood," she replied, "though we grew distant during her years abroad." "You were here yesterday?" "I arrived just before dinner. I had hoped to surprise her." Holmes's brow twitched. "She was not expecting you." "No, I had written but received no reply. So I came regardless. She was delighted to see me, or so she said." "Was something amiss?" Miss Hartwright hesitated. Her composure cracked just slightly around the eyes. She seemed exhausted, haunted even. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. And that dreadful locket. She touched it constantly, like a nervous tick. What did she say to you? She said she feared something was coming for her, something that had crossed oceans and would not be denied. I asked if it was a man or a creditor or some disease. She laughed, said it was none of those. Did she name it? No, only that it began in Madurai and would end at dawn. Holmes nodded slowly. And where were you this morning? I was in the East Wing guest room. I heard the scream. I ran, but the door was locked. Sir Reginald arrived moments later. Then Mrs. Dunhill. The door was broken open together. Miss Hartright's hands were folded tightly in her lap. One last question, Holmes said. Did Eleanor mention a Mr. Sebastian Locke? Miss Hartright's expression darkened. She did, briefly. She said she regretted ever trusting him, that he had taken something from her. But when I asked what, she only shook her head. She stood. I loved Eleanor, she said softly. But I believe she brought something back with her, something she could never put down. When she left, I saw Holmes visibly exhale. For a moment he looked weary, but it passed as quickly as it had come. Next was James Burrows, the groundskeeper, a rugged, middle-aged man with mud-streaked boots and a nervous way of wringing his cap. He was the one who had reported the figure near the garden wall. I was out feeding the hounds, he said, just before 6. The sun wasn't quite up, heard that scream, awful sound, and when I looked up, I saw someone near the east wall, tall fella, heavy coat, moved quick. Did you follow? Tried. But by the time I reached the hedge, he was gone. Thought it best to tell the inspector. Holmes fixed him with a hard stare. Were you near the hedge yesterday evening? No, sir. You're certain? Course. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the fragment of torn cloth we'd found. Then how do you explain this, Mr. Burrows? The man paled. I don't know. Holmes said nothing more, only dismissed him with a flick of his fingers. Last came Edith, the youngest maid, a girl of barely 17. Pale and frightened, she clutched a rosary and refused to meet anyone's gaze. I cleaned Miss Eleanor's room, she whispered, but only during the day. She never let anyone in after dark. Did she confide in you? Holmes asked gently. Sometimes, Edith said, her voice quivering. She told me the locket had a voice. That night it whispered in languages she didn't know, and that it wanted her to see something. Something she wasn't meant to see. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Did you ever hear the locket yourself? Edith began to sob. I did. Once. I swear I did. It screamed, like a soul tearing free. Holmes placed a hand on her shoulder. Thank you. That will be all. When the door closed at last and we were alone, I felt the weight of the room settle heavily over us. Well? I asked. What do you make of it? Holmes turned to the fire. A woman dies in a locked room. A locket screams. A burned letter from India. A man who vanishes in fog. And now, motives. He turned to me. The crime is growing stranger, Watson, which means we are drawing closer to the truth. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring. By the time night fell on Holmbury Park, the manor had returned to a hushed and uneasy stillness. Shadows hung heavy in the corridors, and the candlelight seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm. Even the ticking of the drawing-room clock carried an edge. Ominous, expectant. After the interviews, Holmes requested solitude and spent several hours in the library, poring over the household ledger, letters, and a strange, dusty stack of Eleanor's journals he had found hidden behind a false panel in her wardrobe. I left him to it and took supper with Sir Reginald, though neither of us had much appetite. The master of the house seemed worn, his eyes sunken, his voice a rasp of worry. It was nearly midnight when Holmes called for me. I found him standing at the window in the study, staring out at the moonlit grounds below. The locket, now wrapped in a clean strip of linen, sat on the desk beside him like a relic unearthed from a cursed tomb. "I've come to a preliminary conclusion," he said, without turning. "Oh?" "There is a suspect, one that fits both the psychology of guilt and the geography of opportunity." I stepped beside him. "Miss Hartwright?" I guessed. "She's hiding something." "Indeed," Holmes said. "But so are they all. No, I speak of Mr. Lockwood." "The manservant?" Holmes nodded. His statements were carefully measured. Too precise. "And the destroyed letter, that troubles me. A servant burns a foreign letter on a lady's orders and says nothing of it until questioned. No curiosity, no concern. Either he is a fool or he is protecting something." He picked up the locket and turned it slowly in his hand. I believe Lockwood had means, opportunity, and proximity. He was alone after delivering that letter. No one saw him after 8. And if someone were to stage a scene, a locked-room murder made to look like something otherworldly, it would require familiarity with the estate, with Eleanor's habits, and access to her room during the day to plant or alter items. I frowned. But why? What motive? Holmes tapped the locket against his palm thoughtfully. "That," he said, "is the gap, and without motive, all else is conjecture." The next morning, Lestrade arrived early, freshly convinced he had cracked the case. "It's the manservant," he said triumphantly as he entered the study. "Lockwood found a set of gloves in his quarters with faint traces of white powder, same as that crystal residue you found near the body. And get this, he's no common footman, served as an assistant to a professor of antiquities in Madras before coming to England." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Changed his name on arrival. Was Alfred Lamport before he became Alton Lockwood. Suspicious, wouldn't you say?" "Quite," Holmes said evenly. "And where is he now?" "Held under watch in the gardener's quarters. I'd like to speak with him. Alone." Lestrade, though reluctant, agreed. We followed Holmes through the narrow corridor to a stone-walled side building near the stables. Lockwood sat on a wooden bench, hands folded in his lap. His face was calm, but his eyes held the unmistakable shine of worry. Holmes sat across from him, legs crossed, expression unreadable. "Mr. Lockwood," he began, "or should I say Mr. Lamport, you've had quite the journey from Madras to this frozen corner of England. One wonders why a man trained in antiquities now polishes silver and carries firewood." Lockwood said nothing. "You burned a letter," Holmes continued. "What did it say?" "She asked me not to read it," Lockwood said quietly. "But you did." He didn't reply. Holmes leaned in slightly. "I believe that letter contained a threat, one you recognized, from your past, perhaps from a man named Sebastian Locke." Lockwood's eyes flickered, just once. Holmes saw it. "She feared something, Mr. Lockwood. Not a ghost. A man. And you know who?" The manservant's voice was barely a whisper. "I served under Locke. Years ago, in Tamil Nadu, he was a hunter, not of animals, but of artifacts. Dangerous ones. Eleanor crossed him, took something she wasn't meant to." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "What did she take?" "A relic, a pendant carved from meteorite. They said it carried a curse, bound to the temple priests of Madurai. Eleanor laughed at that, wore it. But something changed. She stopped sleeping, said the pendant whispered to her in dreams." Holmes nodded slowly. "And this locket? It isn't the pendant. It was crafted to contain the pendant's influence. Locke sent it to her after they parted, said it was protection, but she didn't trust it. Said it had its own voice." Holmes sat back. "So you did not kill her?" "No," Lockwood said. "But I think she was already dying, not in the body, in the mind. She said something terrible had followed her here." "Not Locke. Something older." We returned to the manor in silence. Lestrade, thoroughly unconvinced, was already preparing to inform Sir Reginald of Lockwood's arrest. Holmes stopped him. "He is not your man." Lestrade frowned. "You believe his ghost story?" "I believe he has told his truth, and it does not align with the method of this crime. Lockwood's story makes him valuable, not guilty." Lestrade threw up his hands. "Then who? We're running in circles." "Not quite," Holmes said. "We're eliminating the impossible, and what remains, however improbable, will guide us to the truth." As we entered the drawing room once more, Holmes crossed to the fireplace and stared into the embers. "Watson," he said almost to himself, "if you wished to fake a death, to stage it in such a way that no one could explain it, how would you do it?" "I wouldn't know where to begin." "Exactly. And yet someone has done just that." He turned sharply. "We are missing a piece. Something emotional, not logical." I blinked. "Emotional? Yes. This wasn't just a murder. It was a message." "A message to whom?" Holmes looked up, eyes distant. "To someone who would understand what had been taken. Someone who knows what that scream meant." I stepped forward. "And who would that be?" He turned slowly toward the portrait of Eleanor. "That," he said quietly, "is what we must discover before they strike again." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. The next morning dawned cold and grey, with a pale mist coiling along the hedgerows of Holmbury Park. The manor had grown quieter still, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Even the staff moved with subdued steps, eyes lowered and words spoken in hushed fragments. Something had shifted, not in the case, perhaps, but in the air around it. Holmes had scarcely spoken since our encounter with Lockwood the day prior. He rose early, declining breakfast, and took once more to Eleanor's room. When I found him there mid-morning, he was seated on the floor cross-legged, the locket unwrapped and placed before him like a relic at an altar. He looked up at me, not with excitement, but with restraint. "Watson," he said quietly, "have you ever known a scream to leave no echo?" I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I've interviewed each member of the household again this morning. Every account of the scream is slightly different. Mrs. Dunhill said it was metallic, like a violin string. Edith, the maid, described it as like a soul tearing free. But James Burrows, the groundskeeper, said it was shrill, like a woman. Not unnatural, human. And that discrepancy means something." Holmes nodded. "It suggests the scream was not the same to all ears, or more precisely, not the same source. Either multiple people heard something entirely separate, or—" He trailed off and rose to his feet, brushing dust from his trousers. "Or someone mimicked the scream," he concluded. "Why mimic it?" I asked. "To seed confusion, to make what was natural sound unnatural, and there is more. Come." We returned to the drawing room, where Holmes retrieved a small parcel wrapped in waxed paper from his coat pocket. "I visited the local chemist early this morning," he explained. Miss Eleanor's cosmetic tray contained residue from a substance not typically used in English perfumes, calotropin, a compound derived from the Calotropis gigantea, or the crown flower. Extremely rare in England, but common in parts of India. It is used, when refined, as a sedative, or, in greater concentrations, to induce hallucinations and heart arrhythmia. I felt a chill. "You believe she was poisoned?" "No. I believe she poisoned herself, but unknowingly. This compound could have been introduced through her face cream, her tea, or incense. In small amounts, it causes disorientation, confusion, and elevated heart rate. In a closed room, combined with fear, it could simulate death." "You think she was not murdered?" I asked. "I think," Holmes said, "that she may not have been dead when the door was broken down." I sat, stunned. Holmes paced slowly now, like a professor delivering the conclusion of a lecture. "Picture it," A young woman tormented by something she believes is following her. Voices, dreams, a cursed pendant. Her fear is cultivated, nurtured even, by someone who knows exactly how to isolate her. A voice at night, a whisper, a carefully chosen compound introduced into her routine. By morning, she collapses in fear. The body appears lifeless, but no wound, no struggle. Only a screaming locket to seal the scene in unreality. I tried to follow, but the ground beneath the mystery was shifting. You mean to say someone staged her death? But to what end? To frighten. To misdirect. Possibly even to remove her without suspicion. Remove her? Holmes leaned in. Watson, the body was examined only briefly. No autopsy performed. Why? Because the cause appeared obvious to the imagination, though absent to the eye. A frightened girl, dead in a locked room, and a household only too eager to bury her before the truth could rise. I stood slowly, heart quickening. You suspect she is still alive? Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he lifted a small envelope from the mantel and handed it to me. Miss Hartright dropped this yesterday. I found it behind the side table after she left the room. I opened it. Inside was a pressed orchid and a short note. The pendulum swings once more. He is watching from beneath the mirror. E. I looked up. Eleanor. Holmes nodded. She was afraid, yes, but she was also aware. This note, Watson, was not meant to be found by just anyone. He is watching from beneath the mirror. Do you recall the mirror in her room? I did. A tall, oval thing above the dresser. Ornate, antique. I nodded. Behind it, Holmes said, is a false panel. I found the journals there, but I also found another object, this. He withdrew a small, flat disc of polished brass from his coat. It was etched with markings, none I recognized, and cool to the touch. It is not gold, Holmes said. It is pyrophoric alloy, capable of producing heat when exposed to friction, and smell, metallic and sharp. Possibly the source of the scream. But how? It could be rigged, set upon a tension spring. When the locket opened or fell, snap. The disc spins. The friction creates a shriek, not unlike a tuning fork. Ingenious, truly. I sat heavily in the armchair. Then it was never supernatural. No, Holmes said softly, but it was meant to appear so. He turned now toward the window, face hardening. Which leads us to the true inconsistency. The maid, Edith, young, devout, clearly frightened, said Eleanor was devout in her own way. She claimed the locket whispered in unknown tongues. Yes, but Miss Hartright, her closest friend, said Eleanor despised the locket, that she only wore it because she had no choice. That is not the testimony of two people who knew the same woman. One of them is lying, or misled. Holmes turned to me again. Indeed, and when one lies so skillfully, we must ask not what they want us to know, but what they desperately hope we never learn. He stepped back to the desk, rolled the locket back in linen, and placed it in a small velvet pouch. Where are we going? I asked, rising. To the crypt. My breath caught. The family crypt. Holmes nodded grimly. If Eleanor Thorncroft is truly dead, Watson, then she lies beneath the chapel floor. But if she is not... He left the sentence unfinished. The implication, however, rang loud and clear. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. It was near dusk when we descended the winding slope behind Thorncroft Manor. The family chapel, a worn stone structure crouching beneath the yew trees, loomed grey against the twilight. Holmes walked briskly, his overcoat flaring in the rising wind, while I followed closely behind, burdened by an unshakable sense of foreboding. We found the chapel deserted, as expected. Its heavy iron gate shrieked in protest as Holmes pushed it open. The inside smelled of damp stone, wax, and a trace of something far older. Dust blanketed the pews, and a tapestry bearing the Thorncroft crest, 2 ravens atop a sword, hung limp against the back wall. "This place has not known prayer in some time," Holmes murmured. "Was this not once the family's sanctuary?" I asked, peering into the gloom. "Now merely its mausoleum," Holmes replied. "Come, the crypt is below." We passed the altar and descended a narrow stair hidden behind a wall panel. It led to a vaulted chamber of carved stone and iron sconces, long extinguished. A half-dozen sarcophagi lined the walls, each marked with the Thorncroft name and the year of interment. Holmes moved to the most recent, Eleanor Thorncroft, 1893-1910. "Only a week since the funeral," he said. "No time for a full tomb ceiling." He produced a set of slender tools from his coat, pried the iron latches loose, and, with visible effort, slid the lid back. I turned away. Silence fell for a long moment. Then Holmes spoke, his voice curiously flat. "She's here." I turned, heart pounding, and peered over his shoulder. The body lay as it had in death, arms crossed, expression serene. It was unmistakably Eleanor, but something was wrong. Her lips were stained faintly blue, yet the rest of her features bore no mark of suffering. Her skin had not yet taken on the pallor of decay one might expect. Not so soon, perhaps, but it struck me nonetheless. Holmes leaned closer, inspecting her collarbone, then her wrists. "No bruising," he muttered. "No defensive wounds. No scent of calotropin on the skin either." He reached into the folds of her gown and extracted a small sachet tied with black thread. "Rosemary and sage," he said, sniffing. "Folk charms. Placed here after death. Likely by the maid." He examined her fingers, then lifted the chain of the locket still hanging from her neck. "This," he whispered, "is not the same locket." I started. "Not the same?" He held it beside the one he had secured in his velvet pouch. The differences were subtle, nearly imperceptible, but there. This one is lighter, and the clasp mechanism differs. Note the hinge. Someone switched them? Likely during the commotion of her death. But why? And how would one obtain a replica? Holmes replaced the chain gently and closed the coffin once more. "I cannot say yet, but someone wanted the original locket gone, replaced with this decoy. Whatever mechanism made it scream, it was in the original." We stood in the cold stillness of the crypt for a time, the silence oppressive. Holmes turned suddenly. "We must return to the house." "What is it?" "I've made a mistake," he said sharply, "and I must correct it before the night is out." Back at the manor, the halls were alive with soft murmurs. A storm had begun to gather overhead, thunder murmuring in the distance. The staff moved briskly, lanterns lit in every window. Mrs. Dunhill intercepted us in the entryway, her face tight with anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," she said breathlessly, "there's been an incident." Holmes stiffened. "What sort of incident?" "It's Miss Hartwright. She's gone. Vanished from her room an hour past. Her window was open, wide open. We thought she was resting, but when the tea was brought in, the bed was untouched, the covers unslept in." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, his face unreadable. "Has anything else occurred?" he asked. The housekeeper hesitated. "Yes." This was found on the floor by her desk. She handed him a scrap of paper, torn and hastily scribbled upon. He said she woke in the dark, that she screamed a second time, but this time no one came. Monsieur Holmes stared at the note for a long moment, then tucked it into his coat. "This is no longer a case of past crimes," he said quietly. "This is an ongoing act of deception." The remainder of the evening passed in fevered motion. Holmes paced the halls, questioning each servant again with a surgical precision. He paused at the east stairwell, where a candle had been knocked to the floor. A trail of faint ash led from Hartwright's room to the cellar stair, but ended abruptly. She went down, he said, but didn't come up, nor was made to go down, and carried out by another route. Thunder cracked overhead. The manor moaned under the pressure of the storm. I found Holmes later in the study, staring at the mirror above the hearth. She knew something, he said at last, and they knew she knew. Who is they? Someone in this house, someone who moved freely between rooms, who knew how to mirror Eleanor's fear, and now seeks to silence her confidant. He turned suddenly and pressed his hand to the edge of the mirror. It's not the first time mirrors have concealed more than reflection. He pried gently at the frame, and the entire panel slid sideways, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, a narrow passage disappeared into darkness. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "fetch a lantern." We followed the narrow shaft through damp stone and cobwebs, its walls no wider than shoulder width. It led deep beneath the manor, winding, descending, until it spilled into a small vaulted chamber lined with shelves. And there, on a simple wooden stool, sat Miss Margaret Hartwright, eyes wide, hands bound, but alive. She looked up as our lantern light pierced the gloom and gave a sob of relief. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, voice hoarse. They took her from the coffin." I stared. Holmes was already beside her, cutting her bonds. "They?" he asked. "Who is they, Margaret?" She shook her head. "I never saw their faces. Just the voice. A man. He said the grave would never hold her, that she belonged to them now." Holmes's jaw tightened. "We're no longer solving a murder," he said. "We are chasing a conspiracy." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The events of that night had cast a shadow even the morning sun could not dispel. Thorncroft Manor stood under a light, the lawns glistening with rain from the previous storm, while within, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. Margaret Hartwright had been moved to a private guest room under Mrs. Dunhill's watchful care, her nerves still frayed and her speech halting, though she insisted she could remain at the estate. Holmes, however, was unmoved by any calls for delay. "We must not give the enemy time to recover," he said briskly, as he donned his dark frock coat. "They have grown bold, Watson, bold enough to exhume the dead and imprison the living. That signals desperation or confidence. Either is dangerous." We had breakfast in the smoking room, where Holmes alternated between pacing and silent contemplation. His gaze flickered frequently to the hearth, to the portrait of the late Eleanor Thorncroft that hung above it. She looked out with austere, melancholic eyes that, I fancied, held secrets neither life nor death had fully revealed. "There is something in this house," Holmes said at last, "that binds the truth like mortar between stones. But a crack is forming. We need only the right pressure to make it break." He turned abruptly and signaled for Mrs. Dunhill. "I require the presence of every remaining household member in the drawing-room at 11 sharp, he said. "No exceptions. Inform them it concerns Miss Hartwright's well-being." The housekeeper nodded and departed without question, though her lips pursed anxiously. "Holmes," I ventured, "what is it you intend?" "A test, Watson, a small one. Not unlike brushing a feather against a spider's web to see what stirs." By 11 o'clock, the drawing-room was filled with the uneasy stirrings of the manor's inhabitants. Mr. Bourse, Bernard Thorncroft, stood stiffly near the fireplace, his pipe unlit and forgotten in one hand. His sister, Cecilia, sat on a chaise near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Both were immaculately dressed, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Pembroke, the groundskeeper, leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. I noticed the mud on his boots had not yet dried, a detail Holmes clearly observed as well. Beside him, Miss Pruitt, the lady's maid, stood trembling slightly, her eyes darting from one figure to the next. Holmes entered last, deliberately, as if stepping onto a stage. "Thank you all for coming," he said. I shan't keep you long. Miss Hartright is recovering, but she is greatly disturbed by what occurred. She believes someone from this house tried to frighten or harm her. Perhaps even more. A ripple passed through the room. Cecilia's fingers tightened. Bernard's brow furrowed. I've asked you here because I believe the only way to protect her now is to uncover the truth, not through interrogation or accusation, but through understanding. You see, Miss Hartright left behind a letter, written only hours before she vanished. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheet of paper, though I recognized it instantly not as a letter, but as the sheet of poetry we had seen earlier, the verse concerning waking in the dark. A curious passage, Holmes continued, but what interests me is that it bears a notation in the margin. A single word, chalice. He paused. Does that word mean anything to any of you? There was silence. Pruitt looked confused. Pembroke shrugged. Bernard raised a skeptical brow. Only Cecilia responded, with a sharp, barely audible intake of breath. Holmes did not miss it. You've heard it before, he said gently. Perhaps, she replied, eyes downcast. Years ago. It was something Eleanor said. In passing, when we were children, she said she dreamt of a silver chalice. It stood beneath the manor, but it wasn't a cup, it was a door. She said it whispered her name. And you never thought to mention this. She said so many odd things. She was imaginative. Holmes nodded slowly, then turned toward Pembroke. Mr. Pembroke, would you be so kind as to show me the blueprints of the manor, particularly the cellar and substructures? Pembroke hesitated. Don't think we've got any blueprints left, sir. The old ones burned in the stable's fire back in '78. Holmes regarded him a moment, then smiled faintly. I thought you might say that, which is why I had a draftsman's copy delivered from the county archives this morning. He produced a long, folded sheet of parchment and unrolled it across the table. I saw several heads lean forward involuntarily. The crypt beneath the chapel is well known, Holmes continued, but what interests me is this second shaft. This sealed passage here, marked Foundations, South Wing. It ends in what appears to be a chamber, though no doors lead to it now. A buried room. Bernard stepped forward. I've never seen that before. That section was closed off generations ago. Closed off, Holmes repeated. Or hidden. He turned to the others. Miss Hartright was not simply abducted. She was taken along this path, through one of the secret passageways that pockmarked this estate. And she was taken because she knew something, or someone feared that she might know something. He walked slowly around the room, his hands behind his back. She wrote of the locket, of Eleanor, of a chalice, a symbolic door. What if she had discovered that the key to Eleanor's fear, the scream, the fainting, the collapse, was not supernatural, not madness, but deliberate manipulation? He paused beside Cecilia, then Bernard, then Miss Pruitt. Each flinched beneath his gaze. And what if that manipulation had occurred before, years ago, perhaps even to a different Thorncroft entirely? No one spoke. Then Holmes said softly, I am having the sealed chamber excavated tomorrow morning. If any of you have something to share, something that may help us understand what lies beneath this house, now is the time. The room held its breath. But no one spoke. Holmes bowed his head slightly. Very well. Later that evening, as the rain began again, Holmes and I returned to the study. He poured himself a measure of claret and stood at the window watching the trees sway. I saw something today, he said at last. Not in their words, but in their silences. Cecilia flinched at the name Chalice. Bernard's eyes flickered when I mentioned the scream. Pruitt could barely stand straight, and Pembroke, his boots are muddied, but he's not been seen near the chapel since yesterday. And yet they all said nothing. They're hiding something, I said. They are protecting something, Holmes corrected. Perhaps themselves, perhaps each other, or perhaps a legacy they fear to shatter. He turned from the window. But tomorrow, Watson, we break through the wall. And whatever lies beyond it, truth or terror, we shall face it head on. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The following morning arrived, grey and soaked with drizzle, as if the heavens themselves wished to conceal what was to be unearthed beneath Thorncroft Manor. Holmes had made arrangements the previous evening with a local excavation crew, 2 grizzled men of Cornish stock who arrived at the manor before dawn with tools and torches in hand. Bernard Thorncroft had reluctantly granted access, though his disapproval lingered on his lips like unspoken thunder. "I would prefer we not desecrate my ancestors' foundations like grave robbers," he muttered as we descended into the narrow stone corridor beneath the south wing. "This house is older than most families in England. Some doors were meant to stay closed." "Some doors, yes," Holmes replied coolly, "but not the ones behind which living men hide their sins." The passage was cold and smelled faintly of iron and mildew. At the far end, past a collapsed storage alcove, stood the sealed wall Holmes had identified from the county blueprints. Its bricks were newer than those surrounding it, a telltale sign of deliberate concealment. "You see here?" Holmes pointed. "The mortar is less than 40 years old. Someone bricked this up during the later Victorian renovations." With methodical precision, the workmen began chipping away at the wall. Dust clouded the air. Each blow of the chisel echoed like a warning down the narrow corridor. I glanced at Holmes. His arms were crossed, eyes fixed, not just on the wall, but on something deeper. He was listening, not to sound, but to silence, to the absence of footsteps, the pause between heartbeats. And then, a shriek. It came not from below, but from above, high, sharp, unmistakably female. Within seconds, Holmes and I were racing back through the corridor, up the narrow servant stairs, and into the east hallway. Margaret Hartwright's door stood ajar. Inside, the room was chaotic. Her bedclothes were torn aside, her writing desk overturned, and the window flung wide to the storm. Margaret herself stood in the center of the room, disheveled, one hand clutching her chest. A man's shadow vanished through the servants' corridor just as Holmes darted past me in pursuit. I rushed to Margaret's side. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still breathless. He came back. He was here." "Who?" "I don't know. He wore a mask, something over his face. He said I should never have asked about the locket. He tried to take something from my drawer." Her voice trembled as she pointed toward the carved writing desk, which now lay in splinters on the floor. The drawer had been pried open, empty. Moments later, Holmes returned, breath short and expression taut. "Gone," he muttered. "Knew the servant's path too well. Likely fled through the scullery exit and vanished into the mist." "You saw him?" I asked. "A flash. Male. Slightly hunched. Left-handed. Wore gardener's boots. I'd wager Pembroke's, though they may have been stolen." He turned to Margaret. "What was in the drawer?" I kept the locket there." Holmes froze. "The locket Eleanor gave you?" She nodded. "After she collapsed. She pressed it into my hand and whispered, 'Don't let them take it. It knows.'" Holmes knelt by the desk and examined the broken wood. No forced entry at the lock. He knew the drawer's mechanism, likely used a skeleton key or filed tool. He stood abruptly. "This changes matters. Someone feared what that locket might reveal, and they've acted again, more recklessly this time." "You think it held some kind of evidence?" I asked. "I think it held more than sentiment," Holmes replied. "It was Eleanor's last lucid act, entrusting Margaret with something she believed vital." He turned to me. "We must speak to Cecilia. Alone." We found Cecilia in the music room, seated at the grand piano, her fingers resting on the keys though no sound emerged. Her face was paler than before, but not from fear, from grief, or perhaps guilt. Holmes entered without ceremony. "Miss Thorncroft, you must tell us what you know about that locket. We believe it may hold the key to everything, your sister's collapse, her final days, and the attacks upon Miss Hartright." Cecilia hesitated, her fingers trembling on the ivory keys. "She told me once," she began softly, "that the locket was not hers, that it belonged to our mother. No, before that. It had been passed down, always with a warning. Never open it at dawn, never listen too closely. I thought it just family superstition, but Eleanor said it screamed, that it showed her things." "Screamed," I repeated. Cecilia nodded. She said she opened it one morning, just after returning from her trip to the continent. She was different after that. Distant. Frightened of mirrors. Frightened of her own reflection. Holmes said nothing, but I saw his eyes darken, the pattern forming more clearly behind them. "She said the locket was watching her," Cecilia whispered. "She tried to bury it once, but it always came back. Pembroke found it in the soil beneath the chapel, as if it had crawled there on its own." "And you believed this?" I asked, though my voice lacked conviction. "I thought she was mad," Cecilia replied. "But now I wonder." Holmes turned toward the door. "Thank you, Miss Thorncroft. You've helped more than you know." That evening, Holmes and I stood again at the dig site, where the last of the bricks had fallen away. The chamber beyond was small, circular, and lined with ancient stone. It smelled of damp earth and secrets. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and on that pedestal a tarnished silver box, its surface engraved with swirling patterns that seemed almost Celtic in design. Holmes stepped forward and lifted the lid. Inside, the box was empty, but something remained. A faint scent, a trace of velvet fibers, and something else, a clasp, broken, torn from something that once rested within. "The locket was hidden here once," Holmes murmured, "or something like it. But it's long since moved, perhaps more than once." "Holmes," I asked, "what kind of object screams?" He didn't answer at first. He simply stared into the box, as if its emptiness held the echo of something unspeakable. Then he said, "One that carries a memory, or a lie, perhaps both." He closed the lid slowly as thunder rumbled over the moor. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was nearly midnight when Holmes returned to our shared room at Thorncroft Manor, soaked from the drizzle and silent as a statue. He removed his coat with deliberate slowness, draped it over the back of a high chair, and stood by the hearth where the fire had reduced itself to embers. I had been rereading my notes, attempting to arrange the facts in some rational order. Yet, as with many of Holmes's cases, logic felt like a cloak barely veiling something more ancient. An emotion, a secret, a rot in the foundations of the family itself. "You've been gone nearly 2 hours," I said quietly. "Did the moor offer any answers?" "Only in riddles," Holmes replied. "But even riddles serve a purpose. They sharpen the blade." He turned and paced slowly. "This case is no longer about a scream in the night or a stolen locket. It is about memory, more precisely, the manipulation of it. Someone wants very badly to bury something Eleanor remembered, something tied to that locket. Her mind may have cracked under its weight, but I suspect it was a deliberate crack." I leaned forward. "You think she was driven mad?" Holmes stopped pacing. "I believe she was made mad, Watson." The distinction struck coldly against my chest. Holmes retrieved a folded slip of paper from his vest and handed it to me. "Found this in a dry niche in the chapel crypt, tucked behind the loose stone I examined earlier. It had been weathered, but some of the ink remained." I unfolded it carefully. The girl remembers. She knows what he did in 1872. The locket is cursed, yes, but the truth inside is worse than any curse. We must keep her quiet. Burn the pages. Keep the mask hidden. See. I looked up sharply. Cecilia? Holmes shook his head. Possibly. But remember, Bernard Thorncroft's full name is Charles Bernard Thorncroft, and his father, too, was named Charles. The note raised more questions than it answered. The girl remembers, so it was Eleanor who remembered something from her childhood, I asked. Holmes nodded. That's my working theory. Something she saw or heard, perhaps even involving the manor's former occupants. You may recall Bernard was only a child in 1872, but his father was not. And what of the mask? That, Holmes said, is our next thread. The following day, while the manor's household remained tense and subdued after the attack on Margaret, Holmes requested a private audience with Miss Cecilia Thorncroft in the conservatory. I was permitted to accompany him, though at first I served merely as a silent observer, my journal folded in my lap. Cecilia stood among the orchids and withered hibiscus, her silhouette framed by sun-stained glass. Holmes's voice was gentle, but with that precision I knew so well. Miss Thorncroft, I must ask about your father. Cecilia's posture stiffened slightly. What of him? You told us he passed away in 1873, but I've reason to believe that's not the whole story. A beat of silence passed. Cecilia exhaled slowly. You're very clever, Mr. Holmes. Father did not die in 1873. He was committed to Westmore Asylum after an incident that was never spoken of. He disappeared from our lives, and we were told never to speak his name. Mother said madness was hereditary and feared scandal more than grief. Was there a mask involved? Holmes asked quietly. Cecilia's eyes widened. You know, she whispered. Then you've seen the portrait? We exchanged glances. What portrait? In the attic, she said. Behind a locked door. I was forbidden from going near it, but I looked once when I was 12. There was a painting of Father, except it wasn't him. He wore something on his face, a device, silver with jagged teeth and a tongue. It was grotesque, a cruel joke. He had it made himself, Mother said, when the voices began. Did Eleanor ever see it? Holmes pressed. Yes, I showed her, years later. She wanted to know more about Father. She asked too many questions. She found the locket not long after? Cecilia nodded. And everything changed. Holmes stood still, his eyes calculating, yet clouded. He was assembling something not quite physical, threads of trauma, silence, and design. Your father was not merely mad, Holmes said softly. He was afraid. He created something, this mask, perhaps as a way to hold the memory, or to silence it. But why? I asked. Why go to such lengths? Holmes turned to me. Because, Watson, some truths are too terrible to speak aloud. And when you cannot forget them, you cage them, in metal, in memory, in locket or mask. By late afternoon, Holmes had commandeered the attic key from Pembroke and led me past creaking beams and forgotten trunks into the dust-laden upper wing. The portrait room was a narrow chamber beneath the slope of the east roof. Cobwebs blanketed every surface. The air smelled of mothballs and damp linen. And there, on the far wall covered by a sheet, hung a tall canvas. Holmes pulled the sheet aside. We both froze. The painting was hideous. It depicted a man, regal in posture, but with a face entirely concealed behind a silver mask, shaped like a screaming mouth. The mouth was open eternally, its interior black, and the tongue curled like a serpent's tail. It was both mechanical and biological, part imagination, part nightmare. What kind of man commissions such a thing? I murmured. One who wishes to trap something, Holmes replied. Not in paint, but in symbol. He turned and opened a side drawer in the room's solitary cabinet. Inside lay scraps of paper, old letters, and a single strip of red velvet. the same kind that lined the silver box we had found underground, and resting atop it, a clasp. Torn, identical to the one in the box. The locket was in here, Holmes muttered. At least until recently. But who removed it? I heard it too late. The creak behind us. Holmes whirled just as a shadow darted down the attic stairs. "Watson, follow!" We descended in a flurry of footsteps, giving chase across the hall and down the staircase. But the figure was already gone, vanished into the lower wing. Holmes stopped, breathing hard, his brow furrowed. "He was watching," he murmured. "He was listening. Whoever he is, he's tied to this house, to that painting, and to whatever happened in 1872. You think he's the one who tried to steal the locket from Margaret?" Holmes nodded. "And he's growing desperate. The more we uncover, the more reckless he becomes. We are close now, closer than ever." That evening, Holmes remained in silent contemplation for nearly an hour, staring into the manor's great hearth while the rain hammered at the windows. At last, he turned to me. "Tomorrow, we lay the trap." "What kind of trap?" I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted. "One that invites the truth to scream, for the last time." Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. By the time morning broke across the moor, Holmes had already vanished from our chamber. I found a note pinned to the bedside lamp in his meticulous script. "Watson, remain observant. The time for silence is near its end. Keep your eyes on Pembroke, and do not trust the whispers behind the tapestries. I'll return before dusk. S.H." He had left no clue as to where he'd gone or what he intended, but his instructions were clear. Something had shifted. The game, which had simmered in secrets and shadows, was coming to a boil. I took my breakfast in the smaller parlour, joined briefly by Lady Margaret, pale but resolute in her movements. Though shaken by the attempted theft, she showed a renewed sense of purpose, as if the violence had clarified the stakes. "Mr. Holmes seems to think there's more to come," she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of a china saucer. "He asked me to remain visible today. That seems an odd request, don't you think?" I hesitated. "Not for Holmes. He believes the villain may act again, and he wishes to provide temptation." She gave me a look laced with apprehension. "I've no wish to be anyone's bait." "Nor do I," I said gently, "but Holmes would not place you at risk without planning every angle." She managed a wan smile. "Then let us play our parts well, Doctor." For the next several hours, I watched Pembroke with unblinking attention. The butler had returned to his duties with solemn professionalism, but there was a rigidity to his manner that I had not observed before. He spoke less, moved with practiced precision, and seemed to linger just a moment longer near every threshold, every corridor corner. Holmes had told me not to trust the whispers, and now I knew why. Twice, I thought I heard my name spoken faintly when I passed by the rear gallery. Once behind a tapestry near the library, once in the hall to the servants' wing, and always, when I turned, there was no one there. The manor had become a pressure vessel. Even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. Holmes returned just after the sun had dipped below the trees. He entered by the front door, dripping with rain and earth-stained at the hem. He carried with him a large wooden box, wrapped in burlap and secured with iron clasps. "I trust you've kept our stage warm, Watson," he said briskly, "as best I could." "What is that?" "The second half of the trap," Holmes replied. "It was waiting for me in the archives of St. Bartholomew's Sanitarium." He didn't elaborate until we were safely locked in our chamber, the curtains drawn and the box opened on the table between us. Inside lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the pages brittle with age. The ink was faded, but legible. Holmes tapped the first page. "Property of Charles Thorncroft, dated 1871-1873. "His personal journal?" I asked in astonishment. Holmes nodded. Apparently, the asylum kept meticulous records of its more aristocratic patients. I traded a few favors for it. What does it contain? Madness, Holmes said quietly, but also memory and guilt. He writes of a voice in the walls and a silver scream that cannot be unscreamed. He speaks of the locket as a totem, a prison for the truth, and he names the witness, Eleanor. I stared at the words. She saw something when she was a child. She saw him, or what he did, and he knew she remembered. Holmes closed the journal. So now, he said, we shall place the journal in the crypt, in the open, with a fresh red velvet lining and a duplicate silver clasp identical to the locket's. I understood then. You want the culprit to believe the truth has been found again, that it's about to be exposed. Holmes gave a small, fierce smile. And when he comes for it, whether to steal it, burn it, or bury it anew, I shall be waiting. The stage was set. Holmes descended into the crypt alone under the cover of night, the journal hidden within the silver box, placed precisely where the locket had once lain. And then he vanished into the shadows, taking up his place as predator, while the rest of us played our parts as bait. Lady Margaret remained in the drawing room. Cecilia took to the chapel under the pretext of prayer. I stationed myself in the corridor above, watching the staircase, and the manor, ancient and brooding, held its breath once more. The trap was laid. Now all we could do was wait. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The house was silent, so silent, in fact, that even the faint ticking of the hallway clock echoed like a hammer against my temple. Midnight approached, and I sat rigid in a chair above the cellar stairs, straining to hear the slightest disturbance from below. Holmes had vanished into the crypt an hour prior, and I had seen no movement since. I thought of the journal, the bait placed like a bloody morsel in the lair of some unseen beast, and of Holmes lying in wait within the stone vault, his sharp mind and still body poised like a sprung trap. What manner of person would risk returning to such a place of death? Who, in this house, feared the past so deeply they would kill to keep it buried? And then, from the depths of the house, I heard it. Not a scream, nor a thud, only the faint scrape of stone on stone. Slow, careful, deliberate. Someone was down there. I rose at once, but did not move. Holmes's instruction had been clear. I was not to intervene until he signaled. So I waited, my fingers tightening around the revolver in my coat pocket. 5 minutes passed. 10. And then, footsteps. Not from below, but above. I turned, startled, to see Cecilia at the landing, wrapped in a shawl and barefoot. "Doctor," she whispered, "is something wrong?" "You shouldn't be out of bed," I whispered back, alarmed. "Go back to your room at once." I heard a sound, like someone crying in the walls. I stared at her, and something clicked. Holmes's words flashed through my mind. Do not trust the whispers behind the tapestries. I stepped forward. Where exactly did you hear it? She pointed toward the north corridor, near the old servant's stair. That direction? I asked. She nodded. Just now, it came and went. I hesitated for a moment longer, then made a decision. Return to your chamber and lock the door behind you. Do not open it for anyone but Holmes or myself. She seemed to hesitate, but nodded and slipped away, and I followed the sound. The corridor beyond was dark and narrow, the wooden paneling close on either side. I moved quietly, revolver drawn, eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then I heard it again, a whisper, unintelligible but unmistakable, from somewhere within the walls. I moved toward the source and found an old tapestry, faded blue, depicting a knight with a lion's head, and behind it a small servant's door, nearly hidden in the paneling. It was ajar. I eased it open and peered into a narrow passage of stone. Cold air coiled out. Somewhere below, a light flickered, and then another sound, a sharp intake of breath, a gasp, and then a scream. Holmes. I plunged into the stairwell, descending 2 at a time, the echo of my boots magnified tenfold by the stone. At the bottom, I found the crypt door flung open, and inside, chaos. The silver box lay on its side, its contents spilled. Holmes stood over a figure collapsed at his feet. Cecilia. Her hair clung to her cheeks with sweat, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched at something, a shard of glass, jagged and red at the tip. Holmes had a shallow cut across his sleeve. "Stand back, Watson," he said calmly. "She's no longer a danger." I froze. Cecilia. But she was upstairs. Holmes turned to me, and his eyes, though calm, held the steel of certainty. "No, Watson, that was not Cecilia. That was our culprit in disguise." He knelt beside the trembling girl, gently prying the shard from her grasp. "You were protecting something, weren't you? Someone." She looked up at him with eyes rimmed in terror and guilt. He said if I didn't take it back, he'd tell them what I did, what I saw." "What you saw," Holmes repeated softly. And then she broke. A flood of words and tears tumbled from her as if a dam had given way. "I was only a child. I thought he'd gone mad, the noises, the screaming, but then I saw him, standing over her, Lady Eleanor. He had the locket, and he was laughing." She buried her face in her hands. I never told anyone." Holmes rested a hand on her shoulder. "You were 10 years old, Cecilia, and terrified." I stared at him. "But what does this mean, Holmes?" He rose slowly, brushing dust from his coat. "It means, my dear Watson, that the locket did more than scream. It was recorded, and now we know who tried to silence it, and why." He glanced toward the open doorway, where the wind stirred the edges of the tapestry. "And now we find the man who walked these halls in her face." Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. There is a moment in every case, somewhere between revelation and resolution, when the air tightens, as if the house itself holds its breath. We had reached that moment. Cecilia, now resting in the parlor under Mrs. Chilcott's anxious care, had revealed the linchpin of the entire mystery, that she had witnessed the original crime, the death of Lady Eleanor Ravensby many years ago. But more pressing than the past was the immediate danger. Someone had assumed Cecilia's likeness. Someone had entered the vault ahead of us. Seeking to retrieve the journal, Holmes had baited, and in doing so had revealed a cunning far beyond what Scotland Yard could fathom. Holmes stood at the hearth, fingers steepled, eyes fixed not on the fire, but on a spot just above it. "You mentioned," I began cautiously, "that the woman who came to me upstairs was not Cecilia. Then who was she?" Holmes replied without turning. "A man in disguise, Watson. A master of manipulation, whose voice can mimic a child's sob as easily as a vicar's homily." My heart leapt. "You don't mean—" "Yes," he said. "Colin Whittlesey." "The violinist," I gasped. Holmes turned to me, the embers lighting his sharp profile. "A former violinist, yes. More recently, a man of theatre and masks. The note Lady Ravensby penned in the final page of her journal named him as her confidant, and later, her blackmailer. He disappeared shortly after her death, only to resurface in London some years later under a different name. Then the performance at the conservatory was no coincidence," Holmes said gravely. "He returned not for art, but for that which he feared most: evidence. That locket contained more than a scream, Watson. It carried the sound of guilt." We had little time. At Holmes's command, the constable stationed at the Manor's Edge was summoned. Lestrade had returned to London the previous day, confident the case was headed toward its conclusion. How little he understood. Holmes moved swiftly through the house, eyes darting like a hawk. "Whittlesey has likely realized that Cecilia spoke to us," he said. "He'll try to leave before dawn, but not without ensuring silence." "Then she's still in danger?" Holmes nodded. "Grave danger." We reached the servants' stair and climbed swiftly. I carried my revolver. Holmes carried nothing but that old, confident stillness I'd come to know better than any weapon. We reached Cecilia's door. Inside, silence. Holmes motioned for me to wait. He knelt and examined the door frame, then the floorboards, and finally, he rapped softly on the wood. "Miss Ravensby?" No answer. He turned the handle gently and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed unslept in. The window ajar, its curtain fluttering in the wind like a beckoning hand. "Backstairs," Holmes said sharply. "He's taken her." We moved quickly, descending once again through the narrow corridor that led to the old coach house. Holmes paused only once to pick up a length of rope left coiled near the firewood. His mind, as ever, worked far ahead of mine. The coach house door was open. Inside, shadows danced across the ancient beams, lit by the flickering light of a carriage lantern. And at the center of the room stood Whittlesey. He no longer wore Cecilia's shawl, nor the soft slippers that mimicked her step. Instead, he was clad in dark riding clothes, his face flushed with urgency, one hand grasping Cecilia's wrist. She did not struggle. Her eyes met mine and widened with recognition, but she remained silent. Whittlesey turned at the creak of the door, his expression shifting from surprise to something like dread. "Ah," he said, voice smooth as silk. "Too late, Holmes. She's coming with me." Holmes stepped forward. "Let her go, Whittlesey. You've lost." The man sneered. "You think you're clever, don't you, with your dusty boxes and old stories? But none of it matters if no one hears it." "She spoke," I said. That made him falter. "She told us everything," Holmes added, "about the night Lady Ravensby died, about the locket, and about you." His grip on Cecilia's wrist tightened. "Then I've nothing to lose." He reached into his coat, and in that instant, Holmes hurled the rope across the space like a whip. It struck Whittlesey's hand, the unexpected sting causing him to drop the small pistol he had drawn. I moved swiftly, closing the distance and seizing his arms. Whittlesey struggled, snarling like an animal, until Holmes reached him and delivered a swift blow to the temple that dropped him to the ground like a sack of coal. Minutes later, the constable arrived and took charge of the prisoner, who would wake in a cell with the truth of his undoing dawning painfully across his brow. Cecilia sat beside the carriage wheel shivering. Holmes placed his cloak about her shoulders and said only, "It is over." She looked up. "Is it? The scream, the one in the locket. Do you still have it?" Holmes glanced at me and then back at her. "No," he said gently. "It served its purpose." He turned and walked into the morning fog, the weight of 10 years' silence fading behind him. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The dawn that followed Whittlesey's arrest was of the cold, colorless sort that turns everything gray and thin at the edges. I remember thinking, as we made our way back into the manor, that it did not feel like the end of a mystery, but the lull before something deeper emerged. Holmes said little on the return. His gait was deliberate, hands folded behind his back, head bowed just slightly. To any unfamiliar observer, he might have appeared satisfied. But I knew better. There was something unresolved, a shadow in Holmes's eye that had not lifted even after Whittlesey's confession had been extracted, brief and scornful as it was. "I was owed," the man had hissed before being hauled into the constable's wagon. "She promised me her silence and then flaunted her cowardice in silver." Holmes had asked no further questions. He simply turned away, as if the rest were mere clutter beneath a larger truth. Back in the drawing room, Holmes requested tea, not for himself, but for Miss Ravensby, who sat near the window in a pale hush. Mrs. Chilcot fluttered nervously, then vanished in search of some restorative spirits. I leaned closer to Holmes, speaking under my breath. "You've caught him. What else troubles you?" Holmes sighed, and the sound was not weariness, but thought stretching its limbs. "Watson, the mind often seizes upon symmetry. The case, as it stands, appears resolved. The locket, the false Cecilia, the abduction and motive." "Yes, but," he said, "Lady Eleanor's death was not merely accidental, nor wholly spontaneous. There is a question that lingers like dust behind a curtain." "And what question is that?" "Why did Whittlesey return now?" I opened my mouth to speak, then paused. "To retrieve the locket." Holmes shook his head. "Too obvious, and far too risky. Even a desperate man would not disguise himself as a woman for a week and live under the same roof as his intended victim, unless compelled by something more immediate, something that pushed him." "Then what?" Holmes turned and glanced at Cecilia, who was now stirring her tea with a trembling hand. "She," he said softly, "must know." We waited until she had regained composure. Holmes was gentle, more so than usual. His voice, though still precise, carried none of the sharpness it often bore in interrogation. "Miss Ravensby," he said, "when did you last hear from your aunt before her death?" Cecilia blinked, surprised. "Aunt Eleanor? It was a week or so prior, I believe. She sent me a letter, quite ordinary, about the weather and my studies." "Do you recall if she mentioned Whittlesey by name?" "No, I don't think so. Yet she gave you the locket?" "Yes. She left it in her will, with instructions that I receive it when I came of age." Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of the chair. "Interesting. Then let me ask you this. Why was the locket hidden in the manor's oldest vault, a place you yourself had never dared approach until last week?" Cecilia hesitated. I don't know." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You do. Somewhere inside you do. Think. Not with fear, but with clarity." She closed her eyes, and for a moment all was still. Then she told me not to trust the house. Holmes' eyes gleamed. She said, "The house keeps things. Secrets. If I ever felt afraid, I should go to the old vault. That I would find something there. But I didn't understand." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the oddness of the vault? The scratches inside the stone lid, the metal clasp bent inwards?" "Yes. Someone had attempted to open it once before, but failed and left it for years, until now." He rose and crossed to the hearth, taking from the mantel Lady Ravensby's old journal. Flipping to the final page, he pointed to a line we had not examined closely. "To silence him is not enough. The truth must survive the echo of fear." He handed it to me. "You see, Watson, the locket was not merely a key to memory. It was bait. Lady Eleanor suspected Whittlesey would return one day. She orchestrated a trap from beyond the grave. But there's more." He tapped the corner of the page. "A cipher. Her handwriting shifts subtly in pressure every few lines. Look closely." I leaned in. Sure enough, some words were slightly thicker, the ink darker. "An acrostic," Holmes said, satisfied. "The first letter of each darkened line spells hair, the second spell false." My breath caught. "You mean Cecilia?" He shook his head. "No, it's not about her. It's about him. Whittlesey. He believed himself entitled to the Ravensby estate through some whispered promise from Eleanor, but she never intended for him to inherit. The locket's scream, Watson, was not just a recording, it was a declaration. The sound was that of Lady Eleanor naming her killer." "And it worked," I said quietly. Holmes looked down at the fire, as she hoped it would. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was early evening when Holmes requested that every individual connected with the affair be gathered in the great drawing-room of Ravensby Manor. The sun had begun to lower behind the Norfolk fields, casting long streaks of amber through the tall windows. A hush seemed to rest over the estate, as if the very walls anticipated what was to come. Mrs. Chilcot bustled about nervously, while Inspector Gregson arrived from Norwich at Holmes's telegrammed summons, his notebook in hand and suspicion plain on his face. He had been briefed only in vague terms and wore the expression of a man unsure whether to expect a revelation or a reprimand. Cecilia sat stiffly on the edge of a faded settee, her face pale but composed, as though she had resigned herself to some terrible truth not yet spoken aloud. Lord Henry Ravensby, Eleanor's distant cousin and the executor of her estate, stood beside the fireplace, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Beside him sat Miss Jane Lind, the governess, her eyes flitting nervously between Holmes and the others. Whittlesey naturally was not present. He was by now locked securely in the local jail, but his shadow lingered in the room like the scent of smoke after a fire. Holmes took his place at the head of the room, hands clasped behind his back, the firelight reflecting off the sharp angles of his face. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're all here because a murder has taken place." A rustle moved through the group, though no one spoke. "A murder?" Holmes repeated. "That was never intended to be perceived as such. A crime cloaked in the rags of grief, inheritance, and mistaken identity. Lady Eleanor Ravensby did not fall ill, nor did she pass peacefully in her sleep. She was, in fact, executed by the one man she trusted least, and trapped with such cleverness that her vengeance outlived her heartbeat." Gregson scoffed lightly. "I thought Whittlesey confessed." "He confessed to a form of blackmail and emotional coercion," Holmes said. "But the act of poisoning, a slow, untraceable compound slipped into her tonic over several days, was never addressed. The locket's scream was not merely sentimental, it was her death cry, recorded and preserved by her own hand." I watched the reactions. Miss Lind clutched her shawl tighter. Lord Henry shifted uncomfortably. Only Cecilia sat utterly still, her hands folded, eyes glassy. Holmes turned to her. "Miss Ravensby, do you recall a glass decanter of Madeira in your aunt's room?" She blinked. Yes, she insisted on a small glass before bed. It helped her nerves." Holmes turned to Gregson. "That decanter has already been sent for chemical analysis. I expect the results within 24 hours, but I would wager £100 on the presence of digitalis. Slow, cumulative, and easily masked by sweetness." Gregson made a note, the furrow in his brow deepening. "I believe Lady Eleanor suspected the attempt on her life long before her final days," Holmes continued. "Hence the locket, hence the vault, and hence the note she left behind, a cryptic instruction for her niece to follow if ever danger reappeared in the family." Holmes paused, then walked slowly to the hearth. "But here's the curious thing. Whittlesey was not acting alone." A gasp from Miss Lind. Holmes pivoted toward her. "You feared this moment, didn't you?" She rose, trembling. I didn't know he would go so far." "Yet you supplied him with access," Holmes said evenly. "You allowed him into the house through the servants' entrance. You forged the letters Lady Eleanor supposedly sent to her niece, warning her not to trust the estate. You believed you were helping him reclaim what he was owed. But in truth, you were his pawn. And when she died, you were promised a share in the inheritance, were you not?" "I didn't kill her," she cried. I only—" "You enabled her killer," Holmes said coldly, "and the law will decide how far your guilt extends." She collapsed into the chair, weeping. Cecilia rose slowly. "Holmes," she whispered. "And the scream? You said it was real." Holmes's voice softened. "Yes, a sound captured moments before death. Your aunt found a way to speak, even after silence claimed her. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Lord Henry cleared his throat. My God, he murmured. To think that all this was done for a claim to an inheritance. Holmes nodded slowly. Greed is rarely obvious at first glance. It wears many faces: loyalty, duty, even grief. But eventually, the mask slips. He stepped back from the fire, folding his arms. The case, I believe, is closed. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime. Holmes stood motionless by the hearth, his lean frame cast in shadow by the flickering firelight. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant tolling of the hour from the manor's clock tower. "I promised you the truth," he said at last, turning to face us all. "Now let me deliver it, plainly and without flourish." He moved slowly toward the center of the room, where a low table sat between the chairs. On it lay a collection of items Holmes had gathered over the past days: a silk handkerchief, the shattered locket, a torn letter fragment, and a small file no bigger than a thimble. The crime, though layered and complex in its planning, was born of something brutally simple. "Entitlement," Holmes began. Mr. Francis Whittlesey believed that he had been robbed. Whether by the decisions of a family long dead or by the cruelty of fate, he saw himself as the rightful heir to Ravensby Manor. When that door was closed to him by Lady Eleanor, he chose another path. He picked up the locket. This device, crude in appearance, is in fact a simple phonographic mechanism, one capable of recording no more than 10 seconds of sound. A rare thing, likely imported. It was not placed there to terrify Miss Ravensby. It was Lady Eleanor's last desperate message to the world. Holmes then gestured toward the file. Digitalis, foxglove extract. Administered in minute doses over time, it would mimic the signs of a slow and natural heart failure. Lady Eleanor was known to suffer from weak nerves and palpitations, which only added to the deception. Gregson grunted. "And you believe Whittlesey was responsible for administering it?" "Not alone," Holmes replied. Miss Lind, who for years had served in this household, found herself financially tethered to Whittlesey after he paid off her brother's debts. She allowed him access to the manor, relayed information about Eleanor's habits, and, most critically, replaced her medicinal tonics with those laced with the extract. Miss Lind sobbed quietly, her head bowed. But Eleanor suspected. Whether she deduced Whittlesey's intentions or simply feared betrayal, she took measures. She recorded her scream and placed it inside the locket, ensuring that if anything unnatural occurred, her niece would have a sign, a cry from beyond the veil, so to speak. Holmes stepped closer to the table. "Now let us examine the other elements. The torn letter, for instance, was originally written by Lady Eleanor to Cecilia, expressing vague concerns about her will and visitors to the manor. That letter never reached its recipient. Why?" He looked to Miss Lind, who stared at the floor. "Because it would have given Miss Ravensby a reason to question what she was told upon arriving, the claim that her aunt had died peacefully and alone under the care of distant staff." Lord Henry spoke for the first time. "But the will, Whittlesey had no legal claim. He would have been dismissed outright." Holmes nodded. Precisely why he needed the body buried quickly. The death had to appear natural, the locket lost, and Cecilia misled, lest she contest the will or discover her aunt's suspicions. Gregson scratched his chin. "And the scream?" "A psychological ploy, cleverly anticipated. Whittlesey knew that if the girl heard something strange or frightening, she might seem irrational to the authorities. Her claims dismissed, her voice silenced, just as her aunt's had been." Holmes turned to me. "And you, Watson, recall how you felt upon hearing the scream?" I nodded gravely. It chilled me to the bone. "Exactly," Holmes said. "Fear silences truth. That was Whittlesey's final weapon, but it failed." There was a long pause. Miss Lind wept quietly in the corner. Cecilia stared into the fire, hands folded tightly. Gregson closed his notebook with a sigh. "And the final piece." Holmes gestured toward the broken locket once more. It is not just a trinket. It is a record of a murder. In those final moments, Lady Eleanor turned her death into evidence. Then Holmes stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon us all. "I believe the court will find it difficult to ignore such testimony," he said softly. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Inspector Gregson took hold of Miss Lynn's wrist with a gentler hand than I'd ever seen from him. Perhaps it was the tears that softened his approach, or perhaps the heavy truth that Holmes had unveiled had pressed even upon Scotland Yard's harder sensibilities. "You'll come with me quietly, Miss Lind?" he asked. She gave a faint nod, her voice but a whisper. I only did what he asked. I never meant for her to die. Holmes, arms folded, said nothing. As Gregson led her from the drawing-room, Francis Whittlesey remained seated, hands folded neatly in his lap. The smug confidence that had so often curled about his features like cigar smoke was gone. He seemed not angry nor afraid, but merely hollow, like a man who had long accepted the price of his ambition. "I suppose," he said at last, "you'll expect a confession." "No," Holmes replied. "I expect only silence from men like you. Confession is for those with the capacity to regret." Whittlesey looked up at him. "She was never meant to suffer, you must believe that." Holmes gave the slightest shake of his head. "She suffered precisely because you believed that entitlement justifies cruelty." Gregson returned with a constable in tow. Whittlesey rose without resistance, straightened his coat, and allowed the man to bind his wrists. As they departed, a strange hush settled over the manor, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. And now, finally, exhaled. Cecilia Ravensby stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill. Outside, the trees moved gently in the dawn breeze, their branches shifting like pale arms in mourning. "I should have listened to her more," she murmured. "She tried to protect you," Holmes said. "That locket was a message, not a curse." She turned to face him, her face pale but resolved. "What now?" "You'll speak to the family solicitor," Holmes replied. "The will, if forged, will be examined under the law. The rightful inheritance will likely revert to you, and the charges brought against Whittlesey and Miss Lind will proceed." "I don't care about the inheritance," she said. "Then you are already wealthier than he ever was," Holmes answered. We dined that evening in the manor's smaller parlor. Holmes, unusually quiet, sipped at his tea with little of his typical appetite. I, too, felt the fatigue of days unraveling, of motives peeled back like layers of damp wallpaper, each one fouler than the last. "You seem subdued, Holmes," I observed. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. "I was reflecting on the locket, Watson. The scream. Yes, a scream is raw, primal. It needs no translation. And yet Lady Eleanor, in her final hours, chose to express everything through a single sound. Not a name, not a written word. Just fear." I nodded, unsure what to say. Holmes continued. "It was enough. Sometimes the truth is not in complexity, but in simplicity. A single cry can echo longer than 1,000 carefully chosen words." We sat for a while in silence. Ravensby Manor was no longer haunted by secrets, though its corridors still held the hush of grief. The wind outside had picked up, and somewhere in the distance a fox barked against the shadows. Cecilia entered then, holding a leather-bound book. "This was my aunt's journal," she said. "I've only just started reading it, but I thought perhaps—" She hesitated. "Perhaps you would want to know what she wrote of you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "She said you visited her once, long ago. She wrote, 'He sees what others miss, but more than that, he sees what they deny.'" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Your aunt had a rare clarity." Cecilia laid the book on the table, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Thank you for everything," And then she was gone, her footsteps vanishing into the hush of the house. Holmes stood slowly and moved to the window, watching as the night deepened across the grounds. The weight of justice, though properly placed, never brought him satisfaction. He hunted truth, not for triumph, but for its own sake, a pursuit unmoored from praise or reward. As I looked at my friend then, framed by shadow and flickering candlelight, I saw not merely a detective, but a man haunted by the clarity others so often envied in him. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. It was several days later when we returned to Baker Street. The London air had its usual sour perfume of coal smoke and drizzle, but there was something oddly comforting about it. I unpacked my bag with a quiet contentment, grateful for the familiar groan of floorboards and the gentle clatter of Mrs. Hudson preparing tea downstairs. Holmes had retreated to his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The embers of the fire danced before him. But his mind was clearly elsewhere, turning still in the complex labyrinth of cause and consequence we had just escaped. I knew better than to interrupt his meditations, and yet, as I sat across from him with my notebook open, I could not help but pose the question that had lingered with me since our departure from Ravensby Manor. "Holmes," I began, "when did you first suspect that Whittlesey was the architect of the crime?" He gave the barest flicker of a smile. "When he arrived." I frowned. "But he was charming, even deferential." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Too deferential. A man of such ambition does not bow to misfortune unless he has already calculated the benefit of appearing weak." I nodded slowly, pen poised. "And the locket?" I asked. "That was the key," Holmes replied. "Lady Eleanor had very few options at her disposal. A locket that screamed upon opening, a clever device, Watson. Ingenious, even. She knew she might be killed, but she counted on Whittlesey's arrogance. He would think the scream meaningless, or at best, a nuisance. Yet to her niece, it would carry weight. She anticipated that someone with intelligence would come seeking the truth. I leaned forward. "But what of Miss Lind?" Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. A tragic pawn. Her love for Whittlesey made her pliable. He used her, fed her half-truths, convinced her that Lady Eleanor's death was a release, a mercy. Love, Watson, when misdirected, can be the most effective weapon of all. I jotted the words down, struck once again by the frigid precision of Holmes's logic and the reluctant empathy that sometimes flickered beneath it. He shifted in his seat. "Do you recall the ink stain on the edge of the will?" "Of course." "It was fresh," he said. "Too fresh for a document supposedly written weeks prior, a minute detail, but it shattered the facade. Coupled with the maid's altered testimony and Whittlesey's strange interest in mechanical objects, his little monologue about clockworks and compartments, it all pointed to a man obsessed with control and concealment." "You kept much of this from me," I remarked. Holmes opened his eyes and gave me a sidelong glance. "It is not that I do not trust you, Watson. It is that I trust your honesty too much. I needed your reactions untainted, your instincts pure. You observe the human soul with an honesty I cannot emulate. That is why we work well together." It was as close to a compliment as Holmes ever gave. The fire popped. Rain pattered against the windows. For a time, neither of us spoke. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out upon the dim streets of London. "This city," he said softly, "is built upon secrets, some kept in shadows, some carried in hearts. But no secret stays buried forever. The truth, like the dawn, has a way of rising, whether we're ready for it or not." I closed my notebook. "And what of the girl, Miss Ravensby?" "She will heal," Holmes said. "In time. She has strength and clarity. She may not see it yet, but she inherited more from her aunt than just a manner and a name." As he turned back toward the fire, I saw in Holmes' eyes a strange glimmer, not satisfaction nor pride, but something gentler, perhaps sorrow, perhaps wisdom. He took his violin from its case and tuned it in silence. Then, without a word, he began to play a low, mournful melody that floated through the flat like a sigh. It was not the music of triumph. It was the music of understanding. I sat in my chair, eyes closed, letting it wash over me. For all his logic, his analysis, his ruthless detachment, there remained within Sherlock Holmes the faint echo of something deeply human. A soul tuned, perhaps, to the same frequency as suffering, even if he rarely acknowledged it aloud. As the melody faded into the evening air, I realized something else. Holmes did not chase mysteries for sport. He chased them because, in solving them, he could, if only briefly, bring a bit of light to a world forever inclined to shadow. And perhaps that was enough.